So let's do a follow-up to my video on what the big brands can learn from the micro brands. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and this is another follow-up video where I quickly discuss your comments, critiques, ideas, issues, questions of one of my previous videos. And in this case, it's the video I did about what the big guys can learn from the micro brands. Let's get straight into it. So BBJ and Second Hour both raised very similar questions. Both really added another point, which is they felt that the big guys could learn a lot from the micro brands around customer service. I half agree, half disagree, and I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but this is my thought. If you're talking pre-purchase, or I've bought the watch and I want to be in part of the community, I want to know what's going on in the watch community, if that's what you mean, could not agree more. I think the big guys don't do that very well at all. I think some do. I mentioned multiple times, Oris do a fantastic job of that kind of, I'll call it engagement, but it could be called customer service. And I think the fact that Oris do it shows that it is possible for the big guys to do it. Even if it's not like the owner of the company or the CEO, people within the company that represent the company can provide that kind of service, can provide that kind of engagement. Microbrands do that as naturally as breathing. Microbrands need to learn and force themselves to do it. If you mean after sales service, particularly dealing with service problems, dealing with warranties, I'm less comfortable that micro brands provide much of a template for the macro brands. First off, I am sure that there are micro brands who do this brilliantly, who are fantastic at providing that kind of warranty and service problem backup. But equally, there's a lot that are terrible. And the internet is rife with stories about microbrands owners who don't answer emails, don't answer phone calls, and vanish from the face of the earth. Not to mention the other obvious problem of a significant number of microbrands essentially shutter themselves after a couple of watches and leave significant questions about the long-term viability of the watches they sold. So I'm not convinced that microbrands necessarily provide, as a group, individuals may, but as a group, I don't think they provide much of a lesson in after sales and warranty service to the macro guys. Watchmaster went personal, and since I was talking about microbrands, asked me two things. Have I supported any? Which ones do I support? And would I recommend any? I'll answer the second part first. No, I'm not. I'm trying to back out of the recommendation game. I'm happy to have an opinion and tell you what my opinion on a watch, a company, a genre, an idea is, but I'm not going to go so far as to turn my opinion into a recommendation of what you should do. For me to do that, I need to know you. And since I don't, this is very much a one-way communication, me just talking to my camera, I don't feel comfortable giving you recommendations. Now, I have done that in the past. It's actually one of the reasons I stopped doing watch reviews, because I don't want to do that anymore, and I'm stepping away from that. So yeah, I'm not going to answer that question. Now, to answer the question I can discuss, which is, have I supported any and which ones do I buy? No, I've never bought a Kickstarter watch, and I'm not likely to. Not because I've got anything wrong with the platform, not because I disagree with it in any shape or form. It's really just when I sat down and made my long list of watches I want to buy, Microbrands didn't make it onto that list. The vast majority of microbrands come onto my list, basically are selling watches below the niche that I would normally spend my own money in. That is not a criticism of them. It's not that they're bad. It just means they're not for me. The two brands I do kind of keep an eye on, well, three microbrands I kind of keep an eye on is Boulder, who I got into very early, and I bought one or two of their watches when I just kicked off, and I love their kind of brutalist kind of flak tower construction. So that really does appeal to me. So I keep an eye on them because I've got some sort of investment with some of their earlier stuff as well. And I must admit, I do watch the Ming and Farah watches. I do find them quite attractive. And again, that's probably because they both sell really interesting, Farah does some vintage, but a lot of their stuff is kind of forward-looking. It's a bit quirky. It's a bit different. It's very individual. And it also pushes up into my collecting niche, which is, funnily enough, they cop a lot of criticism for being too expensive for microbrands. So, yeah, that's where I suppose I fit. Now, Orange Hand raised, just basically came straight out and said, well, was this all moot because I'm really just comparing apples and oranges? I would say yes, I am absolutely comparing apples and oranges. And so you can't apply exactly the same business approaches. You can't pick up the idea of drop shipping just directly to a customer from a microbrand and then put that, apply that to a watchmaker. It's clearly not going to work. Likewise, the commercial and industrial relations and property and IP and all that sort of stuff is totally different. However, I remain committed to the idea that the fundamental philosophies of getting hold of your distribution and not overproducing, of having price certainty for people, of understanding who your user base is and talking directly to them, not through distributors and retailers, of having an idea of who your enthusiast group is and using that as a launching pad into the rest of the community. I remain pretty convinced those are perfectly useful, perfectly serviceable, and totally applicable concepts and philosophies, no matter how big your brand is. And the example I would give, and I've used this example many times, is Oris. They are a big brand and they are doing all of these things and they are going gangbusters because of it. If Oris can do it, there's no reason any other brand can't. Kitab Shah raised a point really addressing my issue that some microbrands have really pushed themselves down into a cul-de-sac where they can't get out of this little enthusiast swim lane. And his point was that microbrands can do that, can get out of that by producing an offshoot brand, a sister brand. And he used the example of, say, Aviate and Spinnaker. What I would say is that is almost never a viable strategy for a true micro brand. And I would caution against using, I won't caution. I'll flat out say you cannot use Spinnaker and Aviate or Doofa or Earnshaw or James McCabe or Dussault because they are all spin-offs of Dartmouth brands, which is in turn a shell company totally owned by Solar Time out of Hong Kong, which in turn is a massive manufacturer that sells everything from Spinnakers and Doofas and Aviates to $2 watches that are in those carousels on service station counters. They make tens, if not hundreds of thousands of watches a year. To call them a micro brand just destroys the whole notion of a micro brand. And to be honest, if it wasn't coming through, I'm a little annoyed at the fact that they try and trade on this micro brand vibe when they are absolutely anything but. But my annoyance aside, they cannot be used as a model of what is open to a micro brand. They are not a micro brand. They are a very large watch manufacturer pretending to be a micro brand. Bill O'Connor made the point that in the tech industry, agility and constant development and the ability to change was key, and that many of those same principles were applicable in the watch market. Yes and no. I think some sense of agility is important, but then if you look at the single biggest company in the world right now, watch company in the world right now, Rolex, they are where they are precisely because they are not and have not ever tried to be agile. They've taken a very different approach in this community. See, tech is defined by utility and innovation and change, none of which applies to the watch industry. If you can have a watch that never changes, which is fundamentally less useful than anything a lot of your competitors make, and still be vastly more successful than them. So I think there is any kind of business can provide some kind of model for other businesses, but I think we need to be very cautious about comparing a luxury jewelry model, which is frankly what watches are, to a tech useful tool utilitarian. I'm not convinced there's a lot of crossover between those two markets. Bill did also go on to ask about industry consolidation and whether I thought there would be some. Yes, no, and maybe not so much in the future. I think right now there is definitely some industry consolidation going on. In his interview with Adrian at Bark and Jack, Nick Fears spoke about how some of his suppliers, or Nick from Fears, spoke about how some of his suppliers have gone out of business. And now he has had to go to some other people recommended to him by other watch companies, used by other watch companies, to come in as a supplier for him. The point he made was these are companies that don't have websites, that aren't public facing. We don't even know they exist. My suspicion is a lot of them are collapsing, combining, moving around behind the scenes. I think we as consumers have got kind of used to the idea of having lots of brands and lots of choices. I think we will continue to support those retail brands. And as long as, in fact, that industry consolidation that's going on behind the scene with increased reliance on global supply chains is probably going to kill some of the suppliers, but enable a lot more of the retailers to stay open and independent. That said, fast forward 10 years, 20 years, I can see this happening, changing again. I think that as we start moving into additive manufacturing and 3D printing and all these other newer technologies, which could enable very small, very low finance organizations to start producing significant numbers of very high quality components at very low prices, like out of not from big industrial facilities, but from the kind of, office semi-industrial areas that are in every suburb, we could see this wheel turn again. And we could see in 20 years' time, as I say, very small 1, 2, 3-man operations producing half of their own watches from within their own facilities. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yes, right now there will be some consolidation at the supplier end, but we might see a complete change again as new manufacturing technologies come on. Michael Riera made the point that Rolex could really learn a lot from Microbrands. Actually, I don't think so. I think Rolex is a special case. Joseph Stalin had this quote that quantity is a quality all of its own, and that so applies to Rolex. They are so big in the industry that basically the market adapts to fit Rolex rather than the other way around. The next thing I'd say about Rolex is they're a little bit like Microsoft. And they're a duck company. And what I mean by that is all the action actually happens in places that you probably don't see. If we think of Microsoft, we probably think in terms of Windows and Office and those sorts of things. The truth is Microsoft is growing just as fast as Alphabet, just as fast as Apple, just as fast as Amazon, but they're doing it with their business to business and behind the scenes stuff that we consumers don't see. Rolex is exactly the same. We see Rolex as a watch company, but according to places like Ariel Adams and other industry watchers, Rolex for many, many years has been making huge profits and pouring that back into diversified investments. So Rolex is now probably more of a real estate company than it is a watchmaker. Ariel made the point that he thinks, on his estimation, Rolex could sell watches at a loss for decades and not damage its corporate value. So Rolex is in a very different space. The last thing I'd say is, despite all of that, which says that Rolex doesn't really have to worry about some of this stuff, another thing about Rolex is they are, in fact, the ultimate Microbrand success story. unlike Jaeger-LeCoultre, unlike Omega, unlike pretty much any other brand, Rolex was not created by a watchmaker to sell watches that the guy was particularly passionate about. Rolex was created by a jeweler to bringing in other people's products, making very good products, and then on-selling them. So right from the very, very beginning, a lot of the things I think that the big brands can now learn from Microbrands are actually baked into Rolex DNA. The importance of influencers, the importance of social media, the importance of marketing, the importance of brand and brand control, that's second nature to Rolex. They're already doing it, and they've been doing it for 100 years. So they don't need to learn anything from anyone about that. That's part of their DNA. Coming to the end, last question. Super Yova really questioned me specifically and said, I mentioned that some brands get themselves into a bit of a enthusiast brands or microbrands, get themselves into a kind of a box defined by their small community, and they might struggle to get out. And he asked me, give me an example. I would say Laurier is a great example of that. Now, before I go on, that is not a criticism of Laurier, the brand, or the people. I strongly suspect that they're very happy being in that box. That's all they want to be. So all power to them. If that's what they want to be, great. I'm not criticizing their decisions. If, on the other hand, you want to be more than that, if, on the other hand, you want to be a company that sells 50,000, 100,000 watches a year, then I think Laurier is a terrible example. And the reason I say that is because if you look at their watches, they're almost tailor-made to within the enthusiast echo chamber. Small, retro-inspired, mechanical, acrylic domed crystal, all of that stuff that makes YouTubers and video and podcasters go nuts is exactly what anyone outside of this echo chamber does not want. There's a reason that Rolex watches all got bigger. There's a reason why no one else that sells big numbers of watches is going far below 38 to 40 millimeters. Because this whole thing about small watches, for example, is purely for us. It's not about the real people buying the millions of watches a year. It's about us geeks who buy hundreds, if maybe thousands of watches a year. So there's an example of a brand that might struggle if it ever wants to grow. And there's an example of a problem. If you're a brand thinking of growing, I wouldn't follow their strategy as far as they have taken it. Anyway, so that's it. That's my follow-up to your questions and comments. I've got a policy of not doing follow-ups to follow-ups, so I won't talk about this again. Maybe I will next year when I come back. So that's not to say don't leave comments, questions, critiques, and issues. Please do so below. I will address some of those perhaps in the comments, but I'll certainly come back and look at them all next time I look at this topic, as I say, probably in a year or so. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.